Last time we spoke about the Battle of Taiyuan. Following the fall of Nanjing in December of 1937, the Second Sino-Japanese War entered a brutal phase of attrition as Japan sought to consolidate control and press towards central China. Chinese defenses prioritized key railway corridors in urban strongholds like Suzhou and the Jinpu and Lankai railway lines, as well as the Huai River system, forming crucial lifelines. By early 1938, Japanese offensives aimed to link up with forces around Beijing and Nanjing to encircle Chinese positions in the central Yangtze region, threatening Wuhan. In response, Chiang Kai-shek fortified Suzhou and expanded defenses to deter a pincer move, eventually amassing roughly 300,000 troops along the strategic lines. Taiyuan became a focal point when Japanese divisions attempted to press south and link with northern elements. Chinese commanders like Li Zhongren, Bei Zhongqi, Tong Yanbo, and Sun Liangzhong coordinated to complicate Japanese plans through offensive and defensive actions, counterattacks, and encirclement efforts. The victory, though numerically costly, thwarted immediate Japanese objectives and foreshadowed further attritional struggles ahead. This episode is The Flooding of the Yellow River. Well, hello again and welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube. You can help produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War and Eastern Front week-by-week podcasts, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War, my podcast series found on all major podcast platforms. Over on Echoes of War, we just finished up our mini-series covering the Greco-Persian Wars. If you're looking to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, which is about 35 episodes and ongoing, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. The votes are still coming in for the latest exclusive episode, but it looks like the winner is going to be an explanation about the logistics behind the battle for Guadalcanal during World War II. So if that's of interest to you, please go check it out. We last left off with a significant event during the Suzhou campaign. 3 Japanese divisions under General Itagaki Seshiro moved south to attack Taiyuan and were met by forces commanded by Li Zhongren, Sun Liangzhong, and Tong Yanbo, whose units possessed a decent amount of artillery. In a 2-week engagement from March the 22nd to April the 7th, the battle devolved into a costly urban warfare. Fighting was vicious, often conducted in close quarters and at night. The urban environment negated Japanese advantages in armor and artillery, allowing Chinese forces to contend on equal terms. The Chinese also disrupted Japanese logistics by resupplying their own troops and severing rear supply lines, draining Japanese ammunition, supplies, and reinforcements. By April the 7th, the Japanese were compelled to retreat, marking the first real Chinese victory of the war. However, both sides suffered heavy losses, with around 20,000 casualties on each side. In the aftermath of this rare victory, Chiang Kai-shek pushed Tong Yanbo and Li Zhongren to capitalize on their success and increase deployments in the Taiyuan theater to about 450,000 troops. Yet the Chinese army remained hampered by fundamental problems. The parochialism that had crippled Chiang Kai-shek's forces over the preceding months resurfaced. Although the generals had agreed to coordinate in the war of resistance, each still prioritized the safety of his own troops, wary of Chiang Kai-shek's bid to consolidate power. Li Zhongren, for example, did not deploy his top Guangxi troops at Taiyuan and sought to shift most of the fighting onto Tong Yanbo's forces. Chiang's colleagues were mindful of the fates of those like Han Fuzhu of Shandong and Zhong Shiliang of Manchuria. Han Fuzhu was executed for refusing to fight, while Zhong Shiliang, after allowing Chiang Kai-shek to reduce the size of the northeastern army, ended up under house arrest. They were right to distrust Chiang. He believed, after all, that provincial armies should come under a unified national command, which, of course, he would lead. From a national unity perspective, his aspiration was not unreasonable, but it fed suspicion amongst other military leaders that participation in the anti-Japanese war would dilute their own power. This divided nature of command also hindered logistics, making ammunition and food supplies to the front unreliable and easy to cut off. By late April, the Chinese had reinforced the Suzhou area to between 450,000 to a massive 600,000 men to capitalize on their victory. However, these armies were plagued with command and control issues. Likewise, the Japanese licked their wounds and reinforced the area to roughly 400,000 troops, who were fresh and supplied from Tianjin and Nanjing. The Japanese continued their objective encircling the Chinese forces. The North China Area Army comprised 4 divisions and 2 infantry brigades drawn from the Kwangtung Army, while the Central China Expeditionary Army consisted of 3 divisions and the 1st and 2nd Tank Battalions, along with motorized support units. The 5th Tank Battalion supported the 3rd Infantry Division as they advanced north along the railway towards Suzhou. Fighting to the west, east, and north of Suzhou was intense, resulting in heavy casualties for both sides. On April 18th, the Japanese advanced southwards towards Puizhou. Tang Embo's 20th Army Corps, together with the 2nd, 22nd, 46th, and 59th Corps, resisted fiercely, culminating in a stalemate by the end of April. The 60th Corps of the Yunnan Army engaged the Japanese 10th Division at Yuang Mountain for nearly a month, repelling multiple assaults. By the time it ceded its position to the Guizhou 140th Division and withdrew on May the 15th, the Corps had sustained losses exceeding half of its forces. Simultaneously, the Japanese conducted offensives along both banks of the Hui River, where Chinese defenders held out for several weeks. Nevertheless, Japanese artillery and aerial bombardment gradually tilted the balance, allowing the attackers to seize Mengcheng on May the 9th and Hufei on May the 14th. From there, the southern flank split into 2 parts. One force moved west and then north to cut off the Langhai Railway, an escape route from Suzhou, while another division moved directly north along the railway towards Xuxuan, just outside Suzhou. Simultaneously to the north, the Japanese units from North China massed at Jining and began moving south beyond Tangshan. Along the coast, an amphibious landing was made at Yangyangang to reinforce troops attacking from the east. The remaining portions of Taiyuan were captured in May, a development symbolically significant to Tokyo. On May the 17th, Japanese artillery further tightened the noose around Suzhou, striking targets inside the city. To preserve its strength, the nationalist government ordered the abandonment of Suzhou and directed its main forces to break out towards northern Jiangsu, northern Anhui, and eastern Henan. To deter the Japanese army's rapid westward advance and penetration into northern Henan and western Shandong, many leading military and political figures within the nationalist government proposed breaching dams over the Yellow River to delay the offensive, a strategy that would have been highly advantageous to nationalist forces at the time. Chiang Kai-shek vetoed the proposal outright, insisting that the nationalist army could still resist. He understood that with tens of millions of Chinese lives at stake, and a sliver of hope remaining, the levy plan must not be undertaken. Then a significant battle broke out at Lanfeng. Chiang also recognized that defeat could allow the elite Japanese mechanized divisions, the 14th, 16th, and 10th, to advance directly towards Jiangzhou. If Jiangzhou fell, the Japanese mechanized forces on the plains could advance unimpeded towards Tongguan. Their southward push would threaten Xi'an, Xianfang, and Nanyang, directly jeopardizing the southwest rear defense. Concurrently, the Japanese would then advance along the Hui River north of the Daibai Mountains towards Wuhan, creating a pincer with operations along the Yangtze River. Now, what followed was arguably the most important and skillful Chinese maneuver of the Suzhou campaign, a brilliantly executed strategic retreat to the south and west across the Jinpu railway line. On May the 15th, Li Zhongren, in consultation with Chiang Kai-shek, decided to withdraw from Suzhou and focus on an escape plan. The evacuation of civilians and military personnel began that very day. Li Zhongren ordered troops to melt into the countryside and move south and west at night, crossing the Jinpu Railway and splitting into 4 groups that would head west. The plan was to regroup in the rugged Daibai Mountains, a region to the south, and then prepare for the defenses of Wuhan. Li Zhongren's generals departed reluctantly, having held out for so long. Tang Embo was said to have wept at the orders. Under the cover of darkness, about 40 divisions, Just about over 200,000 men marched out of the Japanese reach in less than a week. A critical moment occurred on May the 18th when fog and a sandstorm obscured the retreating troops as they crossed the Jinpu railway line. By May the 21st, Li Zongren wired Chiang Kai-shek to report that the withdrawal was complete. He mobilized nearly all of the Kuomintang Central Army's elite units, such as the 74th Army, withdrew from Suzhou, and then they transferred directly to Lanfang, with a resolute intent to burn their boats there. The force engaged the Japanese in a decisive battle at Lanfang, aiming to secure the last line of defense for the Yellow River, a position carrying the lives of millions of Chinese civilians. Yet Chiang Kai-shek's strategy was not universally understood by all the participating generals, who regarded it as akin to striking a rock with an egg, an old Chinese proverb. For the Battle of Lanfang, the Chinese mobilized nearly all of Kuomintang's Central Army's elite forces, comprising 14 divisions totaling some 150,000 men. Amongst them were the 46th Division of the 27th Army, formerly the Central Training Brigade, and the 36th, 88th, and 87th Divisions of the 71st Army, who were German-equipped. Additionally, the 8th Army, the Tax Police Corps, having been reorganized into the Ministry of Finance's Anti-Smuggling Corps, the 74th Army, and Huzhongnan 17th Corps, the new 1st Army, equipped with the 8th Division, were elite nationalist troops that had demonstrated strong performances in the Battle of Shanghai and at the Battle of Nanjing. They were outfitted with advanced materiel. However, these so-called elite forces were heavily degraded during said campaigns in Shanghai and Nanjing. The 46th Division and Huzhongnan 17th Corps sustained casualties of about 85% in Nanjing, while the 88th and 87th Divisions suffered losses of up to 90%. The 74th Army and the 36th Division also endured losses exceeding 75%. Their German-made equipment incurred substantial losses. Although replenishment occurred, inventories resembled roughly a half-German and half-Chinese mix. With very limited heavy weapons and a severe shortage of anti-tank artillery, they could not effectively match the elite Japanese regiments. Huzhongnan 17th Corps maintained its national equipment via a close relationship with Chiang Kai-shek. In contrast, the 74th Army, after fighting in Shanghai, Nanjing, and Suzhou, suffered heavy casualties, and a few German weapons that it did have were largely destroyed at Nanjing, leaving it to rely on a mix of domestically produced, Hanyang-made armaments. The new recruits added to each unit largely lacked combat experience, with nearly half of the intake receiving just basic training. The hardest hit was Li Hanhun's 64th Army, established less than a year prior, and already unpopular within the Guangdong Army system. Although classified as one of the three Type A divisions, the 155th, 156th, and 187th Divisions were equipped entirely with Hanyang-made firearms. Its direct artillery battalion possessed only 20 older mortars and about 3 Type 92 infantry guns, limiting its heavy firepower to roughly that of just a Japanese battalion. The 195th Division and several miscellaneous units were even less prominent, reorganized from local militias and lacking even Hanyang rifles. Additionally, 3 branches of artillery purchased from the Soviet Union arrived in Lanzhou via Xinjiang between March and June of 1938. Except for the 52nd Artillery Regiment, assigned to the 200th Division, the other artillery regiments had recently received their weapons and they were still undergoing training with them. The 200th Division, having fought a while in the Suzhou area and incurred heavy casualties, was still in training and could only deploy its remaining tank battalion, an armored vehicle company. The tank battalion were equipped with T-26 light tanks and a small number of remaining British Vickers tanks, while the armored vehicle company consisted entirely of Italian Fiat CV-33 armored cars. And if any chance you've listened to my North Africa campaign series on Echoes of War, you know what I think about the Fiat tank models, so you can guess what I think about their armored car models. Running cappuccino machines unfit for war. The disparity in the numbers was substantial, and this tank unit did not participate in the battle, which is probably best for them. As for the Japanese, the 14th Division was a elite Type A formation. Originally organized with 4 regiments totaling over 30,000 men, the division's strength was later augmented. Tohara Kenji's 14th Division received supplements, a full infantry regiment, and 3 artillery regiments to prevent it from being surrounded and annihilated, effectively transforming the unit into a mobile, reinforced division. Consequently, the division's mounted strength expanded to more than 40,000 personnel, comprising 5 infantry regiments and 4 artillery regiments. The 4 artillery regiments, the 24th Artillery Regiment, the 3rd Independence Mountain Artillery Regiment, the 5th Field Heavy Artillery Regiment, and the 6th Field Heavy Artillery Regiment possessed substantial heavy firepower, including 150mm heavy howitzers and 105mm long-range field cannons, placing them far in excess of the Nationalist forces at Langfang. In addition, both the 14th and later 16th Divisions commanded tank regiments with nearly 200 light and medium tanks each, while the Nationalist forces were markedly short of anti-tank artillery. At the same time, the Nationalist Air Force, although it had procured more than 200 aircraft of various types from the Soviet Union, remained heavily reliant on Soviet aid to China aircraft, amounting to over 100 machines, and could only defend a few cities such as Wuhan, Nanchang, and Chongqing. In this context, Japanese forces effectively dominated the Battle of Lanfang. Moreover, reports indicated that the Japanese employed poison gas on the battlefield, while elite Nationalist troops possessed only a limited number of gas masks, creating a stark disparity in chemical warfare preparedness. Despite these disparities, Chiang Kai-shek and the Nationalist government were initially unaware of the updated strength and composition of the Dohara Division. Faced with constrained options, Chiang had also pressed ahead with combat operations. On May the 12th, after crossing the Yellow River, the IGA 14th Division continued its southward advance towards Langfang. The division's objective was to sever the Longhai Railway, disrupt the main Nationalist retreat towards Jiangzhou, and then seize Jiangzhou itself. By May the 15th, the division split into 2 columns at Xiaoshan and moved towards key nodes on the Longhai Railway line. Major General Toyotomi Fusetaro led 2 infantry regiments, 1 cavalry regiment, and 1 artillery regiment in the main assault towards Kachang, with the aim of directly capturing Langfang. Dohala led 3 infantry regiments and 3 artillery regiments towards Nianhuang and Michuan, thus threatening Guide. In response, the Nationalist forces concentrated along the railway line from Lanfang to Guide, uniting Song Xilian's 31st Army, Gui Yongqing's 27th Army, Yu Jishi's 74th Army, Li Hanhun's 64th Army, and Huang Zhi's 8th Army. From May the 15th to the 17th, the Fengzhi Brigade advanced towards Langfang and met stubborn resistance near Gaochang from roughly 5 divisions under Song Chelan, and then was forced to shift its efforts towards Yijigang and Nehang. The defense near Nehang included Shenke's 106th Division and Lang Kai's 195th Division, which ultimately faltered, allowing Dohara's division to seize Nehang, Yijigang, Manzhongzhai, and Ranhunjie. Nevertheless, the Nationalist forces managed to contain the Japanese advances east and west of the area, preventing a complete encirclement. Chiang Kai-shek ordered Chen Chang, commander-in-chief of the 1st War Zone, to encircle and annihilate the Japanese 14th Division. The deployment plan mapped out 3 routes. The Eastern Route Army, under Li Hanhun, would include the 74th Army, the 155th Division, and the 64th Army, a brigade of the 88th Division, and a regiment of the 87th Division, advancing westward from Gude. The Western Route Army, commanded by Gui Yongqing, would consist of the 27th Army, the 71st Army, the 61st Division, and the 78th Division, advancing eastwards from Lanfang. And the Northern Route Army, formed by Sun Tongchan's 3rd Army and Shang Zhen's 20th Army, would cut off the enemy's retreat to the northern banks of the Yellow River near Dingtao, Heze, Dongming, and Kaicheng, while attacking the Dohara Division from the east, west, and north to annihilate its single decisive operation. On May the 21st, the Nationalist Army mounted a full-scale offensive. Yu Jishi's 74th Army, commanded by Wang Yaowu's 51st Division, joined a brigade of Song Xilian's 71st Army, led by the 8th Division, and they drove the Japanese forces at Mazhongzhai into a retreat, capturing Nehang and Reihujie. The main Japanese force, about 6,000 strong, withdrew southwest to Yongjie and Shongtaiji. Song Qilan, commanding Shang Faozhao's 87th Division, launched a sharp assault on Yijigang. The Japanese abandoned the stronghold, but their main body continued to advance towards Yangjie, with some units retreating to Danggangzhou and Maogujai. On May the 23rd, Song Qilan's 71st Army and Yu Jishi's 74th Army enveloped and annihilated enemy forces at Danggangzhou and Maogujai. That evening, they seized Simaogujai, Yangzhang, and Hilo, eliminating more than 1,000 Japanese troops there. The Japanese troops at Dongguchao then fled towards Lanfang. On a random note, I received a comment this week on the YouTube channel that has the same podcast on it. For those of you who don't know, it's called the KNG YouTube podcast channel. A guy was accusing me of being an AI voice. Clearly, me completely stumbling upon my own tongue, naming all these Chinese towns would indicate that I'm not an AI. Sorry, I read that comment this morning. Meanwhile, Gui Yongqing's forces were retreating through Lanfang. His superior strength, Jiang Fushan's 36th Division, Li Lianguang's 46th Division, and Zhong Song's 61st Division, Li Wan's 78th Division, Lang Muhan's 88th Division, and Chen Ke's 106th Division had held defensive positions along the Langfang-Yongzhou line. Equipped with a tank battalion and a armored vehicle company commanded by Xu Qingchuan, they blocked the enemy's westward advance and they awaited Japanese exhaustion. However, under the Japanese offensive, Gui Yongqing's poor command led to the loss of Maizhou and Meizhongji, forcing the 27th Army to retreat across the entire front. Its main force fled towards Qishan and Kaifang. The Japanese seized the opportunity to capture Zhixingjie, Luwangjia, and the Luowang railway station west of Lanfang. Before retreating, Gui Yongqing ordered Lang Muhan to dispatch a brigade to replace the 106th Division in defending Lanfang, while he directed the 106th Division to fall back to Xiyuan. Frightened by the enemy, Lang Muhan unilaterally withdrew his troops on the night of the 23rd, leaving Lanfang completely undefended. On the 24th, the Japanese troops advanced westward from Donggangtou, they entered Lanfang unopposed, thus earning a well-fortified position that they would hold onto. In the initial 4 days, the Nationalist offensives failed to overwhelm the Japanese, who escaped encirclement and annihilation. The 4 infantry and artillery regiments and 1 cavalry regiment on the Japanese side managed to hold the line along Langfang, Luwangjia, Xianyijia, Langfangkou, Zhixiangju, Yangyujia, and Chenliukou on the southern banks of the Yellow River, offering stubborn resistance. The Langhai railway line was completely cut off. Chiang Kai-shek was furious upon hearing the news while stationed in Jiangzhou. He ordered the execution of Lang Muhan, the commander of the 80th Division, to restore military morale. He also decided to consolidate Hu Xiangnan, Li Hanhun, Yu Jieshi, Song Xilan's, and Gui Yongqing's troops into the 1st Corps, with Xu Yue as the commander-in-chief. And again, another shameless plug over to my podcast series, Echoes of War. We actually did an episode ranking our favorite generals of many theaters of World War II, and I have to say, Xu Yue would prove to be one of China's greatest commanders. On the morning of May the 25th, they launched a determined counterattack on Tohara's 14th Division. Zhang Xilan personally led the front lines on May the 24th to rally the defeated 88th Division. Starting on May the 25th, after 3 days of intense combat, Yi Hanhun's 64th Army advanced to seize Luowang Station and Luwangjia, while Zhang Xilan's 71st Army retook Lanfang City, temporarily reopening the Langhai line to traffic. At Sanyu Village, Gui Yongqing's 27th Army and Yu Jiexi's 74th Army captured a series of outlying positions, including Yongenyao, Chailou, Kailou, Yijiao, Shulou, and Baiwangqi. Despite these gains, more than 6,000 Japanese troops offered very stubborn resistance. And during the fighting, Zhu Hongru, the commander of the 302nd Regiment, was seriously wounded, but he continued to fight, shouting out, "Don't worry about my death, brothers. Fight on." He would ultimately die a heroic death from his wounds. By May the 27th, Chiang Kai-shek, concerned that the forces had not yet delivered a decisive victory at Langfang, personally reprimanded the participating generals and ordered them to complete the encirclement and annihilate the enemy west of Lanfang by the following day. He warned that if the opportunity was missed, the Japanese reinforcements would arrive and the position could be completely endangered. The next day, Chiang Kai-shek issued another telegram urging Kang Chan's First War Zone and all participating units to press the offensive. The telegram allegedly had this in it: "It will forever be a laughingstock in the history of warfare if you don't." Meanwhile, on the other side, to prevent the annihilation of Tohara's 14th Division, the elite Japanese 16th Division and the 3rd Mixed Brigade, totaling some 40,000 men, launched a westward assault from Dangshan, capturing Yucheng on May the 26th. They then began probing the outskirts of Guidu. Huangji's 8th Army, responsible for the defense, withdrew to the outskirts of Guidu that evening. On May the 28th, Huangji again led his troops, on his own initiative, retreating to Luaihu and Kaifang, leaving only the 187th Division to defend Yuju Station and Guidu City. At dawn on May the 29th, Peng Lixiang, the commander of the 187th Division, also withdrew his troops, leaving Guidu a completely abandoned city. The Japanese occupied Guidu without even a fight, and the loss of Guidu dramatically shifted the tide of the war. Threatened on the flanks by the Japanese 16th Division, the Nationalist forces were forced onto the defensive. On May the 28th, the Japanese 14th Division concentrated its forces to counterattack Gui Yongqing's troops, but they were defeated again, allowing the Japanese to stabilize their position. At the same time, the fall of Xiangqu compelled Shi Yue's corps to withdraw 5 divisions to block the enemy in Xiangqu, and the Nationalist Army shifted to a defensive posture, with the 14th Division holding Xianyijia and Chuxingji. To the north of the battlefield, the Japanese 4th Mixed Brigade, numbering about 10,000 men, were preparing to force a crossing of the Yellow River in order to join the nearby 14th Division. More seriously, the 10th Division, together with its 13th Mixed Brigade, totaling more than 40,000 men, had captured Luoyang and Baozhou on the Hunan-Anhui border, and they were rapidly encircling eastern Henan. By the time of the Battle of Lanfang, the Japanese forces had deployed more than 100,000 troops, effectively surrounding the Nationalist Army there. On May the 31st, the First War Zone decided to withdraw completely, and the Battle of Lanfang ended in defeat for the Nationalists, forcing Chiang Kai-shek to authorize diverting the Yellow River embankment to relieve pressure. The consequence was a deteriorating strategic situation as encirclement tightened and reinforcement options dwindled, driving a retreat from Lanfang's front. The Nationalist Army had suffered more than 67,000 casualties, killed and wounded more than 10,000 Japanese soldiers, but Lanfang was lost and Zhengzhou was in danger. As in Nanjing, this Chinese army might have lived to fight another day, but the effect on Suzhou itself was horrific. The city had endured Japanese bombardment since August of 1937. The population's mood had swung between cautious hope and utter despair. In March, Du Zhongyuan visited Suzhou. Before he left Wuhan, his friends told him, "The city was desolate and the people were terrified. All the inhabitants of Suzhou were quietly getting on with their business. Sometimes it was even calmer than Wuhan." The Australian journalist Rhodes Farmer recalled a similar image in a book published at the war's end, noting that, quote, "Ordinary townsfolk who become wardens, firefighters, and first aid workers during the raids would go back to their civil jobs." Yet this mid-May departure of Nationalist forces left the city and its outskirts at the mercy of the very angry Imperial Japanese Army. Bombing continued through the final days of battle, and a single raid on May the 14th of 1938 killed 700 people. Around Suzhou, buildings and bridges were being destroyed, some by the retreating Chinese forces, some by the advancing Japanese troops. Taiyuan, the scene of the earlier iconic defense, was utterly destroyed. Canadian Jesuits who remained in Suzhou after its fall recorded that more than a third of the houses were razed, and most of the local population had fled in terror to the countryside. In the rural areas around the city, massacres were repeatedly reported, many witnessed by missionaries. Beyond the atrocities of the Japanese, locals faced banditry in the absence of any law enforcement, and vital agricultural work, such as the planting of seeds, ground to a halt. The loss of Suzhou was both strategic and symbolic. It dealt a severe blow to Chiang Kai-shek's attempt to hold central China and to control regional troop movements. Morale, which Taiyuan had briefly boosted, was being battered again, though not extinguished. The fall signaled that the war would be long, and that swift victory against Japan was no longer likely. Mao Zedong's Yan'an base, far to the northwest, grasped the meaning of the defeat there. In May of 1938, he delivered one of his most celebrated lectures, called On Protracted War, chiding those who had over-optimistically claimed the Suzhou campaign could be a quasi-decisive victory, and argued that, after Taiyuan, some had become rather giddy. Mao Zedong insisted that China would ultimately prevail, yet he warned that it could not be won quickly, and that the war of resistance would be quite protracted. In the meantime, the development of guerrilla warfare remained an essential piece of the long-term strategy that the communist armies would pursue in northern China. Yet the loss of Suzhou did not necessarily portend a long war. It could instead presage a war that would be terrifyingly short. By spring of 1938, the Chinese defenders were quite desperate. There was a real danger that the entire war effort could collapse, and the nationalist government's notable success as protectors of the shrinking free China lay in avoiding total disaster. Government propaganda had successfully portrayed a plan beyond retreat to foreign observers, yet had Tokyo captured Wuhan in the spring, the Chinese army would have had to withdraw at quite a speed, reinforcing perceptions of disintegration. Western governments were unlikely to intervene unless convinced it was in their best interests. With the nationalist leadership competing, instincts persisted. The government pursued welfare measures for the people in the midst of massive refugee relief efforts. The state and local organizations, aided by the International Red Cross, housed large numbers of refugees in 1937 to 1938. Yet there was a harsher strain within policy circles, with some officials willing to sacrifice individual lives for strategic or political ends as the Japanese threat intensified. Throughout central China, the Yellow River, China's sorrow as it's known, loomed as a dominant geographic force shaping history. The low-slated river, notorious for floods and shifting channels, was banked by massive dikes near Zhengzhou, exactly along the line of the Japanese advance towards Wuhan. Using the river as a military instrument was discussed as a drastic option. Chiang Kai-shek and Zhang Qiang's First War Zone contemplated diverting or breaching the dikes to halt or slow down the Japanese advance, a measure that could buy time but would unleash enormous civilian suffering. The idea actually dated back to the 1887 floods that cost hundreds of thousands of lives, and even in 1935, Alexander von Volkenhausen had warned that the Yellow River could become the final line of defense. In 1938, Chiang Kai-shek recognized the futility of defeating the Japanese by conventional means at Zhengzhou, considering unleashing the river's force, if necessary, to impede the invaders. The political and strategic calculus was stark. Protect central China and Wuhan, even if it required drastic and morally fraught measures. A more humane leader might have hesitated to break the dikes and spare the dams, allowing the Japanese to take Wuhan. But Chiang Kai-shek believed that if the dikes were not breached, and Wuhan fell within days, the nationalist government might be unable to relocate to Chongqing in time and would likely surrender, leaving Japan in control of almost all of China. Some have compared the choice to France's surrender in June of 1940, underscoring that Chiang Kai-shek's decision came during the country's most terrifying assault, with Chinese forces much weaker and less trained than their European counterparts. The dilemma over whether to breach the Yellow River dikes grew out of desperation. Chiang ultimately ordered General Wei Rilin to blow the dikes that held the Yellow River in central Henan. There was no doubt about the consequences. Floods would hit vast areas within central China, creating a waterlogged barrier that would halt the Japanese advance. Yet for the plan to succeed, it had to be carried out quickly, and the government could offer no public warning in case the Japanese detected it and accelerated their movement. Zhong Xianyu, the chief of staff of the 8th Division at the time, recorded the urgency of those hours in his diary. The Japanese were already on the northern bank of the Yellow River, briefly delayed when the Chinese army blew up the railway bridge across the river. The destruction of the dikes was the next step. If the area became a sea of mud, there would be no way the Japanese could even attempt to reconstruct the bridge. Blasting the dikes proved easier in theory than in practice, however. Holding back such a massive body of water required substantial engineering, dams thick and well fortified. The army made its first attempt to blow the dike at the small town of Jiaokou between June the 4th and the 6th of 1938, but the structure proved too durable. Another nearby attempt failed as well. Hour by hour, the Japanese moved ever closer. The divisional commander, Zhang Jiajian, asked Zhang Qianyu for his opinion on whether they might breach the dams. Zhang wrote, "I discussed the topography, and I said that two places, Mandukou and Wanyakou, were both possible. But Mandukou was too close to Jiaokou, where the breach had already failed, presenting a danger that the Japanese might reach it very soon. The village of Huanyankou, however, lay further away and on a bend in the river. To give ourselves enough time, Huanyankou would be the best." At first, the soldiers treated the task as a simple military engineering assignment, a rather exciting one in Zhang's words. Zhang and Wei Rilin conducted their first site inspection after dark, late on June the 6th. The surroundings offered a deceptive calm, Zhang recounted. The wind blew softly, and the river water trickled pleasantly. Yet gauging the water level proved difficult, hampered by murky moonlight and burned-out flashlights. They spent the entire night in their car to determine precisely where to break the dike as soon as dawn broke. But daylight seemed to bring home the consequences of what they planned to do, and the soldiers grew increasingly anxious. Wang Songmei, commander of the 2nd Regiment, addressed the workers about to breach the dike. "My brothers, this plan will be of benefit to our country and our nation, and it will lessen the harm that is being done to the people. In the future, you'll find good wives and have plenty of children." Wang's words were meant to reassure the men of the political necessity of their actions, and that fate would not in the traditional Chinese sense, denied them a family because of the enormity of their deeds. General Wei confirmed that Huanyangkou was the right spot. On June the 8th, the work began, with about 2,000 men taking part. The nationalist government was eager to ensure rapid progress. Zhang recorded that the highest authorities kept making telephone calls from Wuhan to check on the progress. In addition, the party sent performers to sing and play music to bolster the workers' spirits. That must have been a sight to see. Senior General Xiang Jian announced to the laborers that if they breached the dam by midnight on June the 8th, each would receive 2,000 yuan. And if they achieved it by 6 in the next morning, they would still be paid 1,000 yuan. They certainly needed encouragement, for the diggers had no artificial assistance. After the initial failures at Jiaokao, Wei's troops relied entirely on manual labor, with no explosives used. Yet the workers earned their payments, and the dike was breached within just a few hours. On the morning of June the 9th, Zhang recorded a rapid shift in mood. The atmosphere became tense and solemn. Initially, the river flow was modest, but by 1 p.m., the waters surged fiercely, flowing like 10,000 horses. Looking towards the distance, Zhang felt as though a sea had appeared before him. "My heart ached," as he wrote. The force of the water widened the breach, and a deadly stream of hundreds of feet wide, comprising about 3/4 of the river's volume, rushed southeast across the central Chinese plains. "We did this to stop the enemy, so we didn't regret the huge sacrifice, as it was for a greater victory." Yet he and the other soldiers also saw a grim reality. The troops who had taken on the task of destroying the railway bridge and the dikes could not bear the flood's consequences alone. It would be up to the government and the people of the nation to provide relief for the countless households uprooted by the flood. In fact, the previous evening, Commander Jiang had telephoned to request assistance for the flooded out of their homes. Wei, Zhang, and their troops managed to escape by wooden boats. Hundreds of thousands of farmers trapped in the floods were less fortunate. Time magazine's correspondent Theodore White reported on the devastation a few days later. "Last week, the ungovernable Yellow River lashed out with a flood which promised to change not only its own course, but also the course of the whole Sino-Japanese War. Severe breaks in the dikes near Kaifeng sent a 5-foot wall of water fanning over 500 square mile areas, spreading death. Toll from the Yellow River floods is not so much from quick drowning as from gradual disease and starvation. The river's filth settles ankle deep on the fields, mothering germs, smothering crops. Last week, about 500,000 peasants were driven from 2,000 communities to await rescue or death on whatever dry ground that they could possibly find." Chiang Kai-shek's government had committed one of the grossest acts of violence against its own people, and he knew that the publicity could be a damaging blow to his reputation. He decided to divert blame by announcing that the dikes had not been broken, but been breached by the Japanese aerial bombing. The Japanese in turn fiercely denied having bombed the dikes. White's reporting reflected the immediate response of most foreigners, having heard about the atrocities at Nanjing and Suzhou, and had been disinclined to give the Japanese the benefit of the doubt. Furthermore, at the very time the Yellow River was flooding central China, the Japanese were heavily bombing Guangzhou, causing thousands of casualties. To White, the Japanese counter-argument that the Chinese themselves were responsible seemed unthinkable. "These accusations, foreign observers thought were absurd. For the Chinese to check the Japanese advance at possible to sacrifice 500,000 lives would be a monstrous Pyrrhic victory. Besides, dike cutting is the blackest of Chinese crimes, and the Chinese army would hardly risk universal censor for some slight tactical gains." But of course, that is exactly what they had done. During the war, the Nationalists never admitted that they, not the Japanese, had breached the dikes. But the truth quickly became widely known. About a month later, on July the 19th, U.S. Ambassador Johnson noted in private communications that the Chinese blocked the advance of Zhengzhou by breaching the Yellow River dikes. Eventually, some 54,000 square kilometers of central China was flooded. If the Japanese had committed such an act, it would have been remembered as the prime atrocity of the entire war, dwarfing even the Nanjing massacre or the Chongqing air raids in terms of the number of people who had suffered. Accurate statistics were impossible to obtain in the midst of wartime chaos and disaster, but in 1948, figures issued by the Nationalists themselves suggested enormous casualties. For the 3 affected provinces of Henan, Anhui, and Jiangsu, the number of dead was put at about 844,489, with some 4.8 million people becoming refugees. More recent studies place the numbers a little bit lower, but still estimate the dead at about 500,000 and 3 to 5 million refugees. In contrast, the devastating May 1939 air raids on Chongqing killed some thousands. Zhang reflected in his diary that the breaching of the Yellow River dikes was a sacrifice for a greater victory. Even to some Japanese, it seemed that the tactic had been successful in the short term. The first secretary of the U.S. Embassy in Wuhan reported that the flood had, quote, completely checked the Japanese advance on Zhengzhou. It had prevented them from taking Wuhan by rail. Instead, he predicted the attack was likely to come by water and along the northern shores of the Yangtze. Supporters of the dike breaches could argue that these acts saved central China and Chiang Kai-shek's headquarters in Wuhan for another 5 months. The Japanese were indeed prevented from advancing along the Langhai Railway towards Wuhan. In the short term, the floods did what the Nationalists wanted. But the flooding was a tactic, a breathing space, and it did not solve the fundamental problems. Chiang's armies needed strong leadership and rapid reform. Some historians suggest that Chiang's decision was pointless anyways, since it merely delayed the inevitable. Theodore White was right. No strategic advantage could make the deaths of 500,000 of China's own people a worthwhile price to pay. However, Chiang Kai-shek's decision can be partly explained, though not excused, by the context. We can now look back at the actions of the Nationalists and argue that they should not have held on to Wuhan, or that their actions in breaching the dam were unjustifiable in the extreme. But for Chiang, in the hot summer of 1938, it seemed his only hope from denying Japan as much of China for as long as possible, and to create the best possible circumstances for a long war for China's interior, while keeping the world's attention on what Japan was doing. The short delay won by the flooding was itself part of a strategy. In the struggle raging within the soul of the Nationalist Party, the callous, calculating streak had won, for the time being. The breaking of the dikes marked a turning point as the Nationalists committed an act whose terrible consequences they would eventually have to answer for. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And don't forget our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War and Eastern Front Week by Week podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, or Echoes of War, my podcast series found on all major podcast platforms. If you're looking to support me further, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/the Pacific War channel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. In late 1937, China's front line trembled as Japanese forces closed in on Wuhan. Chiang Kai-shek faced a brutal choice: endure costly defenses or unleash a very desperate gamble. Chiang's radical plan emerged: breach the Yellow River dikes at Huangyankou to flood central China, thus buying time. The flood roared, washing villages and futures away, yet slowing the enemy. The battlefield paused while a nation weighed courage against civilian suffering, victory against devastating costs.